This is the horrific life of a male concubine in the Roman Empire, and once you hear it, you will never see Rome the same way again. Marble palaces, golden columns, and power dripping in blood, these were the symbols of Rome's greatness. But behind those walls lay stories that history tried to bury. Among them, the most haunting are the tales of men who were neither called slaves nor soldiers, but something far more humiliating, far more terrifying. The boy's homeland had once been a place of warmth and belonging, where the soil beneath his feet carried the scent of freedom, and the voices of his ancestors echoed in songs sung around firelight. His people lived not in grandeur but in dignity, each sunrise bringing with it the comfort of family, the rhythm of tradition, and the pride of identity. Yet, all of this was ripped apart in a single night, when Roman banners appeared on the horizon like a storm of fire and steel. What had once been home was reduced to ash and silence, its people bound in chains, their cries swallowed by the clash of swords. For the boy, the world of his childhood was erased in an instant, replaced by the endless weight of captivity and the haunting memory of freedom he would never touch again. Dragged across seas he had never known, he arrived in Rome not as a man but as merchandise, stripped bare, inspected and priced. The bustling markets overflowed with human lives, men with strong arms sold for the fields, women taken for service, children scattered like objects to be owned. But he was different. His skin, his youth, his striking features marked him not for the plough or the battlefield, but for something Rome hid beneath its marble and gold. Behind the laughter of nobles and the feasts of senators lurked a hunger that consumed the conquered in ways more insidious than chains. In the eyes of those who measured his worth, he was not a worker nor a soldier, but a body, an exotic possession stripped of name and soul, to be molded into submission. When the gates of the imperial palace closed behind him, the true horror of his fate began to unfold. Rome dazzled with splendor, golden columns, marble statues, fountains that sparkled in the sun, but beneath this glory was a darkness that history dared not preserve. Here he was groomed not to serve with honor, but to surrender his very humanity. His existence was reduced to whispers in corridors, to shadows in candlelight, to a life lived only at the command of another's desire. He became part of a secret world where men were not men, but ornaments of power, used, discarded, and silenced. And though his heart still carried the memory of freedom, every passing night carved away at his soul until he understood the terrible truth. In Rome, his body belonged to the empire, but his suffering would belong only to history's silence. He had once lived in a land that breathed with freedom, a place where every sunrise painted the hills in fire and gold, where rivers wound through valleys like veins of life, and where the earth itself seemed to sing with the voices of his ancestors. The boy's homeland was not mighty like Rome, nor clothed in marble and gold, but it was rich in something greater, dignity, belonging, and the strength of tradition. He had grown up in the rhythm of that soil, mornings filled with the laughter of children chasing each other in fields of grain, evenings where families gathered around firelight to share bread, and stories that carried the wisdom of generations. His people knew who they were, where they came from, and where they belonged in the endless cycle of life and death. There was pride in their customs, honor in their songs, and freedom in the very air they breathed. He too had been part of that tapestry, woven into it by birth, nurtured by the warmth of kinship and the certainty that tomorrow would rise much like today, until the night Rome came like a shadow to smother the flame. The warning was not thunder or storm, but the unnatural silence of a sky that refused to shine, a stillness before the clash of worlds. They came with fire in their hands and steel in their fists, a tide of armored men whose banners glowed in the torchlight like the wings of demons. His village, once so alive with voices and music, erupted into screams. The air filled with the acrid smoke of burning roofs, the metallic stench of blood spilling on soil that had once been fertile with grain. He saw neighbors dragged from their homes, their lives ended not by old age, but by the blade of a soldier who saw them only as obstacles. The world of his childhood collapsed in a single night, a tapestry torn apart by foreign hands, leaving nothing but ash and silence where once there had been joy. He was young, too young to understand the full cruelty of empire, but old enough to remember the feel of the rope biting into his wrists, the way his mother's cries echoed into the darkness until they were silenced by a soldier's strike. He was bound, dragged with others, their feet stumbling over the ruins of their lives, forced into a line that marched away from everything familiar. Behind them, their world burned, the sky above painted red not by the setting sun, but by the flames of conquest. Ahead of them lay the unknown, a void into which their identities would vanish. For the boy, the memory of that night would remain etched into his soul, the last glimpse of his home, glowing not with the warmth of family, but with the fire of destruction, the last sound of his people, not in laughter or song, but in screams drowned beneath the march of Roman boots. He was no longer a child of his homeland. He was now a captive of Rome, a nameless body in a chain of conquest, pulled into a darkness from which he would never return. The road to Rome was not paved with stones of glory, but with the broken bodies of the conquered, and he was one among thousands pulled along its cruel path. Day after day, under the lash of soldiers, the captives stumbled across foreign soil, their feet torn open by rocks, their mouths dry with thirst, their spirits collapsing under the weight of chains. Some fell and never rose again, their bodies, left for the crows on the roadside, reminders to the rest that weakness was death. He watched elders collapse, mothers clutching infants torn away, and children no older than himself dragged until they lost all sense of home. Every night under the cold stars, he lay on the hard earth listening to the weeping of those who still had the strength to cry while others remained silent, their grief buried too deep for sound. For him, the chain around his neck was not the heaviest burden. It was the knowledge that he was no longer seen as a son, or a brother, or even a child. He was property. When they finally reached the coast, the horror only deepened. The sea stretched endlessly, a monstrous expanse of black water beneath a sky that offered no mercy. Wooden ships waited, their hulls like gaping mouths ready to swallow lives whole. The captives were herded aboard, packed together in suffocating darkness, their bodies pressed so close they could scarcely breathe. The stench of sweat, blood, and fear filled the air until it became a poison, choking hope itself. Weeks blurred into one another as the ship creaked and groaned, waves slamming against the sides like fists of the gods. Some prayed, some cursed, many simply gave up and sank into silence, their eyes empty as if their souls had already fled. Disease spread, chains clinked in the dark, and each sunrise claimed more lives than the last. By the time Rome's shores finally appeared, the boy no longer remembered what freedom had felt like. The sea had taken from him even his sense of time. Days and nights dissolved into one endless nightmare, broken only by the whip strike or the cry of someone breathing their last, yet nothing compared to the spectacle that awaited them on land. Rome greeted its slaves not with pity, but with greed, the great markets overflowing with human flesh like livestock pens dressed in marble. He was stripped bare, oiled, and forced to stand under the gaze of buyers whose eyes saw nothing of his humanity. They discussed his body as one might discuss a tool, his height, his skin, his youth, his strength. Around him, families were torn apart in an instant, a mother sold to one master, her child to another, lovers separated by the wave of a hand, siblings dragged in opposite directions. Cries filled the air, but they meant nothing in the language of Rome, where gold determined fate. He was not bought for the fields, nor for labor, nor even for the games of the arena. The way they looked at him was different, hungry, calculating, as though his value lay not in what he could do, but in what he could be forced to surrender. In that moment, as the price for his life was counted in coins, he understood the cruel truth. He was not a man, not even a slave of ordinary kind. He was chosen for a fate darker, more humiliating, and more secret than anything he could have imagined. The gates of Rome's imperial palace rose like the jaws of a beast, glittering with marble and gold, a vision so dazzling it might have seemed like heaven to those who had never seen beyond their own villages. To him, however, it was no paradise. It was a cage, beautiful yet unescapable. As he crossed its threshold, the boy felt the weight of history pressing upon him, for this was the heart of the empire, the seat of emperors who commanded legions and ruled the world. But within its polished corridors lay shadows darker than any battlefield. He was led through halls lined with statues of gods and heroes, each carved in stone as if to mock his flesh and blood suffering. Servants moved silently, their eyes lowered, their lives bent beneath invisible chains. Every detail of the palace spoke of power, the fountains that gushed with water while captives thirsted, the floors that gleamed as though polished with tears, the feasts that overflowed while others starved in the streets. The empire celebrated its triumph, but hidden within its heart was a chamber of silence where dignity was stripped away more thoroughly than any robe. Here, his transformation began. He was washed, perfumed, his hair cut and combed, not for his comfort but for the gaze of others. His body was measured, inspected, adjusted until he was no longer himself, but an object sculpted for desire. The handlers spoke of him not as a boy, not even as a slave, but as if he were a jewel, a possession, too rare to be wasted on labor. He was forbidden to speak, forbidden to look too long at those who examined him, trained instead to bow his head and submit. Slowly, he began to feel his own identity dissolve. The child who had once run free beneath open skies was gone. In his place stood a hollow shell, prepared for the appetites of those who wielded unchecked power. He was dressed in silks he did not recognize, placed in chambers that felt more like gilded prisons than rooms, and taught gestures of obedience that broke his spirit more than any chain could. Every step in this process was a reminder that he was not a person in the eyes of Rome. He was a vessel, a shadow, a plaything crafted for the empire's secret hunger. And yet, the most chilling truth came not from what was said, but from what was left unsaid. In the whispers of servants, in the fearful glances exchanged in corridors, in the silence that hung whenever the subject of concubines arose, he sensed the fate awaiting him. He had not been chosen for the fields or the mines, nor for the arena where men could at least fight for glory. No, his destiny was to serve in the shadows of pleasure, a role so degrading that history would bury it in silence. He did not yet know the full extent of what awaited, but the dread coiled inside him like a serpent. Every polished wall, every golden cup, every torch that flickered in the night seemed to whisper the same message. In Rome, his body was no longer his own. And as the doors of the inner chambers closed behind him, he understood that the worst was yet to come. The days inside the palace began to blur into one another, not because they were ordinary, but because they were stripped of meaning. Every morning he was awakened not by the warmth of family or the sun's gentle rise, but by the cold commands of handlers, who treated him like a tool being sharpened for use. His body was scrubbed until his skin stung, his posture corrected with slaps and whips, his movements rehearsed until they no longer belonged to him. He was trained not in skills of war or craft, but in silence, obedience, and the art of erasing himself. Each gesture, each step, each bow was designed to reduce him into something less than human, a vessel for another's will. What horrified him most was not the cruelty itself, but how it was delivered with precision, as though his suffering was part of a ritual refined by centuries of practice. This was Rome's hidden machinery, the quiet destruction of men, transformed into objects that bore no name, no voice, no soul. The cruelty was not only physical, it was psychological and far more suffocating. He was forbidden to speak except when commanded, forbidden to meet the eyes of those above him, forbidden even to carry memories of who he once was. Whenever he tried to recall the songs of his homeland, the rhythm of his people's dances, the warmth of his mother's embrace, he was punished, not with blows, but with mockery and scorn, reminders that such things had no place in Rome. 2. The palace, his past was filth to be erased, his identity a weakness to be crushed. His very skin became a brand, marking him as different, foreign, and exotic, something that could be flaunted, displayed, and consumed, but never respected. He saw it in the eyes of those who inspected him, in the way they whispered of his origins, as though he were a curiosity brought from the edges of the world. What had once been his heritage became a weapon used against him, a reminder that he would never be seen as equal, only as spectacle. And in the silent corridors of the palace he was not alone. Others shared his fate. Men from distant lands, each carrying their own scars, each broken in their own way. He saw them move like shadows, silent, obedient, their eyes hollow, their spirits extinguished long before their bodies failed. Some were older, their shoulders bent from years of degradation. Others were young like him, still clinging to fragments of themselves, though each day stripped those fragments away. They rarely spoke, for fear was the only language they were permitted to share, but in their silence he saw his own reflection. Men reduced to ornaments, breathing yet lifeless, waiting for nights that would devour them. It was in those moments, when he saw his future mirrored in the emptiness of their stares, that the true weight of his fate settled upon him. He was not merely enslaved, he was condemned to become invisible, his humanity erased in service to pleasures that would never even acknowledge his suffering. The palace that dazzled outsiders with gold and marble became for him a labyrinth of humiliation. Every chamber, every corridor seemed to whisper his inferiority, reminding him that he existed only at the mercy of others. Banquets were the worst. He would watch from the edges of the hall as senators and generals feasted on roasted meats and overflowing wine, their laughter echoing against the walls like a cruel chorus. He was not invited to eat, not even allowed to exist as a servant in dignity. His role was far more silent, far more degrading. They wanted him to be seen only when desired, touched only when commanded, spoken of not as a person but as a possession. The contrast was unbearable. Marble floors polished to mirror brightness while he slept on cold stone, golden goblets overflowing with wine while he survived on scraps barely fit for animals. Rome celebrated itself as the light of the world, but in its heart it turned men like him into shadows, erased and voiceless. It was not just the nobles who crushed him, it was the entire system that fed on bodies like his. The empire thrived on conquest, and every conquest brought more lives. Into its markets, more men and women torn from their homelands to be reshaped into tools of power. In this machinery, he was a rare prize. His foreign features, his youth, his body all transformed him into something that Rome's elite considered both exotic and desirable. That difference, which once tied him proudly to his people, now marked him as property of the highest order. He became a symbol of both Rome's arrogance and its cruelty, proof that even the most intimate parts of a man's existence could be conquered, owned, and displayed. Every time he was summoned, every time eyes lingered on him, he felt the weight of centuries of prejudice pressing down. It was not just his freedom that had been stolen, it was his right to exist as an equal being. Slowly, he began to feel the change within himself, a transformation as terrifying as the chains that bound him. At first he resisted in silence, clinging to memories of his homeland, replaying the voices of his family in his mind. But the palace was relentless in its erosion of hope. Each act of obedience stripped away a layer of resistance. Each day of submission made yesterday's defiance feel further away. He caught himself moving automatically, bowing before he thought, lowering his gaze before he even realized, performing obedience as though it had been stitched into his very flesh. That was Rome's true cruelty, not just the breaking of the body, but the molding of the mind until the captive became his own jailer. And in this slow death of the self, he realized the greatest horror of all, that one day he might look in the mirror and no longer recognize the boy who had once run free under the sun. As the days turned to weeks, the palace walls began to feel less like stone and more like a living cage that pulsed with his fear. He realized his fate was no accident. Every glance, every command, every ritual of preparation was shaping him for a single purpose. The whispers of servants confirmed what he already felt. He had been chosen not for labor, but for the hidden appetites of Rome's most powerful men. The thought hollowed him out from within, leaving him trembling even in silence. He was no longer waiting to see if the worst would come. He was only waiting to learn when. And in that waiting, dread became his constant companion, a shadow that followed him into every breath, every step, every restless night. The night he had feared from the first moment of his capture finally arrived, and it came cloaked not in violence but in ceremony. He was summoned into a chamber unlike any he had seen before, a room dripping with gold, marble, and shadows, its air heavy with incense and whispers. The torches flickered against polished walls, making the grandeur of Rome seem almost alive, and in that terrible glow, he was nothing more than a trembling figure pushed forward by unseen hands. There was no chance to resist, no voice to raise. In protest, the empire did not require his consent, only his presence. Before him sat Rome's elite, men whose decisions shaped the fate of nations, their faces calm and cold, their eyes settling on him as if he were not a human being, but an object of spectacle. Every detail of the ritual reinforced his erasure. He was stripped, adorned not with garments of honor, but with chains of submission, positioned under the gaze of men who saw his suffering as both their right and their entertainment. Time slowed to a crawl as humiliation gave way to pain, and pain gave way to a hollow silence inside him, the moment his spirit broke. He did not scream. The cruelty of Rome had already stolen even that defiance from him. Instead, he felt himself sink inward, retreating to a place so deep that no hand could reach him, as if the boy he once was had fled, leaving behind only a shell to be used and discarded. In that chamber, surrounded by power and silence, he ceased to be a person in the eyes of Rome. He became a symbol, proof that the empire's hunger for dominance extended not only to lands and armies, but into the very bodies of the conquered, until nothing remained but submission carved into flesh and memory. When dawn finally broke, the world looked unchanged. Rome still gleamed with its temples and triumphal arches, the markets still roared with voices, the senators still plotted in their marble halls, but inside him nothing remained the same. The boy who had once lived with laughter, who had once carried the warmth of his homeland in his chest, was gone. What remained was a hollow vessel, marked forever by a night that stole more than his freedom. It stole his very sense of self. And yet, in that emptiness, there was a strange, unspoken truth. He was not alone. For every concubine hidden behind gilded doors, for every slave whose name history erased, there were countless others who bore the weight of Rome's cruelty in silence. His suffering was not an isolated tragedy. It was a mirror of an empire's heart, a reflection of how power consumes the powerless and calls it glory. Centuries later, ruins of Rome would crumble into dust, its emperors would fade into forgotten statues, but the pain endured by those like him would remain, echoing through time as a warning. The empire believed it could erase their humanity, but the very act of erasure is what condemns Rome in memory. Its greatness was built not only on conquest, but on bodies broken and lives devoured. And so, the boy's story lingers as both accusation and reminder that behind the shimmering myths of civilization often lies the darkness of exploitation. So ask yourself, when we celebrate the monuments of the past, whose voices have been silenced beneath their stones? And when history remembers empires as glorious, who pays the hidden price of that glory?